The caged skylark is, like the poplar field, another poem which involves a bird as one of its main symbols. The title introduces the main conflict of the poem because we're thinking about two images juxtaposed that don't go together, they clash. So a bird, because it can fly, symbolizes freedom. And this bird as well, because of its song that you might like to look up on the internet and listen to, its song is very beautiful, also suggests joy. So putting caged and skylark together then in the title introduces this idea of a conflict between lack of freedom, caged, and being able to fly, which is freedom. We've also got the misery from being caged with the joy or beauty expressed in the bird's song. Remember, there are more poems about birds in English literature than there are about any other animal. This is because writers, artists generally have traditionally found birds fascinating because of their flight, symbolizing ideas like imagination, creativity, freedom. Also perhaps the divine, because they can fly up into the heavens. But not just their flight, but also their song. And the poet is a kind of singer as well. Remember, poetry is originally an oral art. At the beginnings, it's played to music. So the bird is a bit like a symbol of the poet. It might also be because you've got so many different kinds of birds. There's a big, interesting cast of characters. The skylark, in particular, is known for flying vertically upwards, very high and quickly. It has a vertical display flight, and when he gets to the top, he just hangs there for a few minutes and sings. So it flies vertically upwards and sings at the top. So the idea of an ascent and then joyous singing at the top in this poem comes to represent some ideas about what happens to the human spirit as well. So it's very important that you know from the title the main conflict or tension is being introduced, and that this skylark is being used as a symbol to explore ideas about the human mind or soul. It's a poem about a bird, but it's not just about a bird. There are a couple of difficult words that I've highlighted in red that you need to make sure you understand the basic meanings of. So we'll do those first before we get into looking at some of the main quotations. The description of man's mounting spirit in his bone house here refers to the body. So bone house is the body. Imagine your body being like a house of bones where your spirit lives. That's what the image is of. The next tricky one is aloft on turf. Aloft on turf. So in the cage of a skylark, it is traditional to put some clover. So he's in a cage, but still standing on turf. That's what aloft on turf means. And then the image of drooping deadly here means like it's dead. It's not like a deadly attack where it might kill you. It means death-like. So those are some words or phrases that people often find difficult in writing about the poem. Make sure you know what they mean. Let's look at the first sentence. As a dare-gale skylark, scanted in a dull cage, man's mounting spirit in his bone house, mean house dwells. That bird, beyond the remembering his free fells, this in drudgery, day labouring out life's age. Here then, we've got the image of the skylark daring the gales, and a gale is a strong wind. So it's an image of how outside the cage, the skylark was brave enough, adventurous enough to fly despite strong winds. So it's an image of freedom and energy. It contrasts then with its current life in the cage, which is described as being dull. I've just highlighted in blue some of the interesting sounds and the effects of the meter in this first image. Because look how dare, gale and dull cage are all metrically stressed. This poet Hopkins is quite difficult in terms of his meter or how he arranges the stressed syllables. There's something called sprung rhythm that you might like to look up. He thought that he'd invented his own method of organising the rhythmical sounds in the English language into patterns called sprung rhythm. The accents on some of the letters in this poem are to do with that. Put bluntly though, it's best to read it as a kind of free verse, so you're unlikely to find any specific patterns in it. Instead, just look at where you do get metrical stresses and then think about what they might emphasise. So dare gale and dull cage are all monosyllables that are stressed, and thinking about the images as a pair, we can really see the tension between them, going from daring to being dull, and then the force and freedom of the gale blowing through the open skies versus the cage. So dare gale, dull cage, working as a pair of images, capturing that tension we had, that conflict implied by the title. Scanted is an interesting image as well. If you talk about having scant supplies, for example, going on a journey, it means you haven't got enough provisions. So there's the idea here that the bird has been confined or neglected or deprived in the cage. Remember, whenever you can, if you choose an image or quotation as being one of your most important ones, make multiple points about it. So it's an image of physical confinement, but also a sense in which it's failing to fulfill its potential. There's a kind of injustice to caging this bird. And the line begins with as. So that's an image introducing a comparison. So just like this skylark, scanted in a dull cage, man's mounting spirit in his bone house, mean house, dwells. So as the cage is to the bird, so your body or bone house is to your mounting spirit. So that's another image picking up on the conflict of the title, except now it's been developed beyond just the physical bird and cage into a metaphor to explore the relationship between body and soul. Just as the cage is dull, the bone house is mean, as in meagre or restrictive, confining. So we very quickly, in the first two lines, moved from the physical to the metaphorical or spiritual. Mounting would be my word to comment on here. It suggests the idea physically of rising up through the air, but it also can connote ideas about gaining honour or increasing in excellence. So that would associate then the upward movement through the sky with a kind of spiritual ascent as well. When it says man's, it doesn't mean purely men. It means mankind's. Some people complain about that kind of language nowadays, but rewrite the poem as peoplekind's mounting spirit, and it doesn't sound quite as good, does it? That bird, beyond the remembering, his free fells. This is quite a sad image because the free fells is when the bird used to be out flying in the gale, daring it. But now that seems so far gone that it can't even remember what that used to be like. It's beyond in the sense of out of reach. There's a kind of oblivion, a forgetfulness. It doesn't even remember what it used to be like to be free. It's been so long, and the cage is so confining. So some comments you might have about that could be that maybe its spirit seems broken, as if it can't ever fly again. Does this make us pity the bird's state, and by extension, through the metaphor, the spirit of man as well? What is the possibility that it could be renewed to regain its former glory? Because it can't remember its free fells, it now just has to face this in drudgery, day labouring out life's age. Day labouring out, the way it's been hyphenated is an interesting word to explore as well. It means to just drudge through day by day. There's a sense of monotony there. And yet, we now change tone, change direction a bit, which is why I've put my first section division here. Though aloft on turf, or perch, or poor low stage, both sing sometimes the sweetest spells. So that when the singing comes in, we've marked the second section of the poem. Remember, sections don't have to come in where new stanzas come in. So this one is breaking up what in this sonnet is the octet, the first 8 lines, from as to or. A new section comes in when the singing starts. Both sing sometimes the sweetest spells, yet both droop deadly sometimes in their cells, or ring their barriers in bursts of fear or rage. So perhaps they're not totally broken after all, because although the power of flight is deprived, they can at least still sing. Yet, despite the singing, they droop death-like. Remember, deadly means death-like. It's not a deadly droop that if you look at it will kill you. It's that it's so exhausted, so weary, so dejected that it seems dead. So droop here, explore in these terms. Weariness, physical, perhaps spiritual as well, bearing in mind human beings are being compared to the bird. Perhaps it feels hopeless, a sense of dejection or despondency or extreme depression here. And to droop can also mean to be laid low, as in to be felled or die. Could compare perhaps droop here in the sense of being laid low or felled with the free fells that the bird used to have, because that also in a way is an image of dropping down, a kind of drooping, except there it was a fast descent through the sky, whereas now it's trapped in the cell, in the cage. So drooping and free fells could be worth linking. Remember, it's a good idea whenever possible to read quotations in the context of each other. Don't cherry pick them and talk about them in isolation. Remember, a good poem is like a spider's web. You touch one little bit of it, and then the rest of the poem also vibrates. And a grade 9 answer is going to be thinking about what the vibrations are. Yet both droop deadly sometimes in their cells, or ring their barriers in bursts of fear or rage. So the barriers here are the cage and also, metaphorically, the bones of your body. And here, because of cells, we're thinking about the bird and the human spirit as kind of prisoners behind the barriers. And to ring means to twist, force. And it suggests the idea of distress. So there's a desperation here. They're really trying to escape, to break free. That's why perhaps burst would also be a good image to explore. It reaches a point where they can no longer contain it. And then either through fear or rage, they attack the barriers, trying to burst out. Not that the sweet fowl, song fowl, needs no rest. Why hear him babble and drop down to his nest, but his own nest, wild nest, no prison. So you might be thinking, because they are ringing the barriers in bursts of fear or rage, that they never need to rest. That would be incorrect, because even in the wild, after singing, the bird drops back down again, drops back down to his nest. But here's the crucial detail. His own nest, wild nest, no prison. So there's a contrast between the wild nest versus the cage. He needs some kind of nest, but you can't turn a cage into a nest because it's not his own. the cage is like a prison. Normally around line 9 or so in a sonnet, you get what's called a volta, or a turning point. Here it comes in at around line 9. I've marked the section "but his own nest" as the beginning of my third section, because I think "but" shows the clearest change in direction. So the nest symbolizes, unlike the cage, ideas of safety, security, and perhaps also, because that's where the eggs are, life as well, or fertility. Whereas the cage, where there's the deadly drooping, is about death. So moving from this idea of the wild nest versus the cage, the speaker then comes back to the image of how that applies to the body and the soul. Man's spirit will be flesh-bound when found at best, but uncumbered. So what this means is that there's never going to be a time when your spirit will be totally without its body and still be at its best. So the spirit needs the body to be at its best. In traditional Christian theology, there is the resurrection of the body. A whole human being has both body and soul. So Hopkins here, who was a Jesuit, is trying to think about what the dynamic between body and soul is. He's not a Platonist who is saying that really the body is evil or needs to be discarded for the soul to fully flourish. Instead, the soul needs the body to be at its best. So flesh-bound here is an interesting image to explore. It's not that you're bound as in a cage. The bird is bound by a cage at the beginning. Here, the sense of being flesh-bound conveys ideas about vitality or passion. The blood of the flesh is what gives the soul its full life. So I would compare bone house earlier, the image of the body as a bone house, where the bone is bloodless, to the image of being bound by flesh in this more positive vision of the relationship between body and soul. It's a bit like comparing the cage and the wild nest. The bone house here, or mean house, is a bleak image of the body, and then being flesh-bound later comes in as a richer alternative. To cumber is similar to the modern word to encumber. So uncumbered suggests the idea that this flesh-bound spirit isn't distressed, troubled, or burdened by it. It's not a bad thing. It doesn't limit it in the way that the cage limited the bird. So uncumbered suggests, because of the prefix un, freedom from distress, trouble, or burden. And the way that idea is communicated is through this great image of how meadow down is not distressed for a rainbow footing it. So if you see a rainbow in a field, the fact that it begins on the ground, footing the meadow down, doesn't distress the meadow down. Footing can mean to set foot on, i.e. the rainbow looks like it's planted on the ground, like it's standing on it, but foot can also mean to dance on. So the image of the rainbow is an image of dancing or jubilation, and perhaps therefore conveys this mood or atmosphere of joy. And that introduces the concluding image of the poem, which is of risen bones. So man's spirit, with the resurrection of the body, the risen bones, will also experience this sense of dancing and joy. Most people writing about the way this poem is structured will tend to get bogged down by explaining what the overall rhyme scheme is. that can very easily lead to quite waffly, generalized comments that you need to avoid. You'd be much better off to pick out just a couple of rhymes. Here's an example that you might like to explore. Think about how prison and risen work as an effective rhyme. You could argue that this is what is called a counter-semantic rhyme. Counter-semantic. I'll just put the spelling of that up here. Semantic is to do with the meanings of the words, and when they run counter to each other, it means that the rhyme captures a juxtaposition. So in the context of the poem, to be in prison is to droop, to be confined, to be trapped or held down, whereas risen is, like the vertical display flight of the bird, an image of ascent and freedom. Ascent as in A-S-C-E-N-T, opposite of descent. So prison and risen then together capture that conflict that we talked about in the title right at the start. So it's a rhyme that captures a sense of conflict that we see in the whole poem, and it could therefore be a good one to talk about your personal response to the speaker's overall attitude or message. Here's an example of a student's answer on this poem to help you see some of the pitfalls to avoid, but also so you can see a reminder of some good exam technique. The question is about how the poet makes the caged skylark significant. So one thing we need to watch out for is whether or not this key word is going to be in every paragraph. Remember, the exam board is very keen on repetition of the wording of the question throughout the answer to show focus. Hopkins makes the extract significant, so that's a good start. Hopkins explores the idea of the soul being held within the confines of the corporeal frame by comparing it to the eponymous caged skylark. So this sentence as an opener is good in that it pinpoints the theme of the body or corporeal frame being a confining environment for the soul. But it could have used some proofreading, because if your opening remark contains a silly mistake, like Hopkins makes the extract significant by Hopkins explores, then it just creates a bad first impression. It's like when you first turn up to meet someone and you trip up. It's hard to get over that initial impression. So check carefully, don't make silly mistakes. He explores the extended similarities between the daily existence of man and the bird in the octave, while in the sestet he explores how the bird's freedom in the natural world, although a great release, is as nothing compared to the transfiguration of the human soul as it is released from the body. This outlines the movement of the poem quite nicely, and he uses the correct terms for the sonnet, octet and sestet, and thinks about how it changes direction. However, there's a big problem with this, and it's that he says that at the end the soul is released from the body. But if he'd paid more careful attention to the concluding images, he would have seen that actually it's not about release from the body at all. It's about how the risen body no more distresses the soul than a rainbow does meadow down. So it actually concludes with an image of the acceptance of the body as no longer a bone house or mean house. So the main meaning or message of the poem, which is so important for you to pinpoint in the introduction, has here been misread. So it could easily have been avoided by including a brief quotation from the end of the poem that summarizes the meaning or message. You can see that there's no quotation from the poem anywhere in the introduction. And because of that, he's made a slight misconception, which has showed quite a fundamental misunderstanding of the whole point of the poem. It's not about escaping from the body. The final image is one of unity. The risen bones at the end aren't a bad thing. So quote from the end of the poem to help you explain what its main meaning or message is. The speaker's attitude then, which you also need to mention in the introduction, is going to be difficult to get right if you've got the message wrong. So the attitude towards the body isn't that it's something that you need to escape from. It might start with an element of frustration, seeing it as a mean house or bone house, a bit like a cage to a bird, but by the end, the attitude is actually acceptance or harmony. The first main paragraph should, we hope, include some reference to how Hopkins makes the poem significant. So ideally, we'd want to see in the opening sentence, the topic sentence, a reference to the wording of the question, but we don't. And if we skim down the rest of the paragraph, you can see that at no point anywhere in the paragraph do we get any reference to the wording of the question. This is a very easy thing to fix. Just make sure that you begin each paragraph and throughout the paragraph make some effort to answer the exact question you've been asked. How many quotations do we have here? We've got man's mounting spirit in his bone house. Then we've also got coming up next, the dare gale skylark. Then both sing sometimes the sweetest, sweetest spells. And then a focus on cells too. And then ringing their barriers in bursts of, should say, fear or rage. Try to avoid misquoting if you can. Again, that's something if you check your answer at the end, you can easily fix and avoid conveying carelessness to the examiner. So in one paragraph then, we've got 5 quotations. Sorry, 6, because they're both droop deadly. Remember that the exam board say that 6 to 7 quotations in the whole essay is all you need in principle to get full marks. And as a consequence of having quoted 6 times in just one paragraph, the price to pay is not being able to go into each one in enough detail. Some examples might be these. Man's mounting spirit in his bone house, referring to the fact that a human soul is confined to his skeleton, his body, and that he must break free of this cage. Well, a bit more on mounting would have been effective. Zoom in on that one word, explore what it means and also what it suggests. Bone house as well. What might bone symbolize? How's it different from flesh bound at the end? Exactly. So ideas about death, for example, could be a good starting point. If the quotation had been shorter and more detail had been given for it, the mark would have been higher. Dare gale skylark highly emphasizes the similarities between the two creatures. Well, it's not at all clear what the reasons are for that comment. What is it about dare gale that's interesting? Why has he quoted this phrase? We need to get reasons in there. So what I'll be looking for to improve this paragraph is next to every quotation, because, as, since, and a reference back to how it's significant. Dare gale skylark emphasizes the similarities between the two creatures because, as, since. Think about how many reasons you can give for each quotation that you use. This paragraph has too many quotations in and not enough is said about each. The only way you can show the precision and depth of analysis you need for full marks is if you prioritize which details are truly important and explain your reasons fully. At the end as well, this is what I call a mic drop comment or an attempted mic drop. The poem is a sonnet, and in octet, the writer further describes the relationship between the bird and man. The reason this is a mic drop is that it shows that you know it's a sonnet, but you get so carried away with that you think merely by mentioning it, you've done the job. So you can imagine this is the end of the paragraph here. He's dropped the mic and walked away. But what you need to do is say why it matters that it's a sonnet. How is the sonnet form used as a tool by the poet? So think more about what the volta is after the octet, why the turning point comes in, what the change of direction is. What do you expect of a sonnet, and what does this one do? Next paragraph, again, first thing we're checking for, has he answered the question? Where is the word significant used? It should be in the first sentence ideally, but it's not. And if we skim down the rest of the paragraph, we can see again, at no point is the word significant referenced. If we count quotations again, we can see here, we've got the babble of the bird, and how there is no longer the sweet fowl, song fowl. And then we've also got drops down to his nest, own nest, wild nest, no prison, hear him, hear him. Some examples perhaps of misdevelopment again. The rhyme scheme changes from the first stanza to represent the change in the bird's life and happiness, as now it is free. At least here there's an attempt to comment on a change in the rhyme scheme, but to make this even better, it would be preferable to comment on one particular rhyme. Pick out the moment where it changes, which rhymes show the change and why they're important. The image of dropping down to the nest, or the wild nest versus the prison, is said to heavily emphasize the fact that the lark is free of his cage and has found a sense of comfort as he is no longer trapped between bars and confined to his cage, but free in nature. This is a slightly better comment, and we can see that one of the magic words, because, as, or since, has been used with as here, so he's giving a reason why he thinks this quotation is important. If further detail had been added about what the nest symbolizes, that would have been even better. So try to give multiple ideas about quotations whenever you can. You can probably guess what I'm going to say about the last paragraph. It's crucial in your last paragraph that you show off your best writing, because the exam board says that the end of poems tend to include the most important images. Quick check, do we have the word significant anywhere? Is it answering the question? Should be in the first sentence to show a relentless focus on the question. It's not. And in skimming down the rest of the answer, significant would have been easy to include, but we're missing out. Instead, try to include it at least once. Quotation count again. We've got man's spirit will be flesh bound when found at best, suggesting that there is a limit to man's potential happiness while he is still trapped inside his body. This is where the misreading comes in. So it shows us that more careful attention needs to be paid to what the final images actually mean. It's not about an escape from the body. Instead, it is about an acceptance, maybe even celebration of the body. The Catholic Catechism describes the flesh as being the hinge of salvation. So really, rather than having trapped inside his body, the comment on how man's spirit, when it's at its best, should show that the spirit needs the body for a full life. The same misconception applies to uncumbered, which doesn't actually mean that the spirit needs to be released from the body that traps it. In fact, it's precisely that the body does not cumber the spirit. When we come to the analysis of meadow down, the point isn't that it's tranquil and holy, so much as the fact that down is very soft and light and fragile. So what this comment should actually say is that the body no more distresses the soul than a rainbow does meadow down. And of course, because light is weightless, the rainbow footing the meadow down actually distresses it not at all. So there should be a connection made between the meadow down and the idea of being uncumbered. The idea of the meadow creates the image of a place of freedom, which contrasts the dark place was presented at the beginning of the poem. Just note again that 5 minutes of checking can really help you to eliminate these silly mistakes that convey an overall poor impression. I think that it's a good idea to make contrasts and links between quotations and it's especially effective, as is done here, to make links between the end and the beginning of a poem. But although some of the ideas about the bird and the body were developed well in this essay, there's a failure to fully explore what the point about the meadow is at the end. Yes, the rainbow is associated with divinity and hope, but the point here is that it doesn't distress the meadow down any more than the body distresses the soul. This sentence here is the final sentence of the entire essay. And sadly, because we're just repeating points we've already made, it doesn't really get this candidate any more marks. Instead, the best way to finish is to have a very brief conclusion, perhaps just 4 to 5 lines long, roughly the same length as your introduction, where you summarize your personal response to the poet's meaning and message. So something here perhaps revolving around one particular image that the candidate best thinks sums up the mood, atmosphere, or attitude of the poem would have been a more effective way to conclude. To sum up this answer then, I would say that there need to be fewer quotations, but they need to be explored in greater detail, using because, as, and since to give full reasons why each has been chosen. The relevance of each quotation to the question also needs to be clear. The foundational building block of a good answer is to answer the question. So whatever keyword you're given, significant, vivid, moving, tense, make sure you refer to it frequently. For each quotation you've chosen, ask yourself, why is this significant? And then, if it's made your shortlist of your top 10 or super 7 quotations, give the reasons why. You should, if it has been prioritized as being one of the best ones for this question, have at least 1 or 2 reasons for it. Those reasons might start with the basic meanings of the words and then could move beyond that to thinking about implications or suggestions, perhaps making links to other images. The answer does a good job of moving through the poem chronologically, but there are so many misconceptions about the final images in the poem that overall it turns into a misreading of the poem. Pay very careful attention to the final images of a poem because they're likely to tell you what its main meaning or message is. If in doubt, I would spend a little less time writing about the beginning and the middle and make your final paragraph the longest. And make sure you allow yourself time to explore it fully and carefully. There is an attempt to deal with the layout of the poem on the page and the sonnet form, but it's a bit general. If you can make those points more individual and specific and relevant to the question, they can be very helpful. Otherwise, they tend to lead you astray. Here's an example of the kind of way to write about quotations to gain some extra marks. Rather than quoting a large chunk of text, or even a whole sentence, zoom in on a detail that you think is most significant. We said that one of the problems with that essay was that too many words were quoted at once, which meant that there wasn't enough time to go into detail on each of the individual words. So don't be afraid sometimes to use just single word quotations. Make sure that what you have to say about the quotation you've chosen is linked to the wording of the question. So zoom in, then go straight to whatever the key word of the question is. Then it's a good idea to challenge yourself to try to give 3 reasons why you think that word is an important one. Remember, the exam board recommend using because, as, and since as words to help you give reasons for your quotation choices. If you start with a basic point, as in here, mounting shows the spirit is rising, thinking about how it might develop the theme or tension of the poem, that's a good way to begin. But you might want to bring in an extra point, showing off your ability to think of the language in a more sensitive way. Suggesting alternative ways in which the images can be read is a good way to do this. And make sure that you also bring it back to the impact or effect on the reader. If you have, for each paragraph, 2 or 3 quotations where you go through this because, as, and since process, making sure you always refer back to the key word, then you're going to make sure that you attend to the language with sophistication, precision, and subtlety, while still answering the question. Here's an example of what a good essay structure would look like for this poem. Note that we make sure that the key word significant in this case is in every single paragraph, the introduction and the conclusion, but also each of the three main body paragraphs. We have one on the beginning, one on the middle, and one on the end of the poem, going through it chronologically, thinking about how the main theme or tension is introduced, how it's developed, and then what the final thoughts or feeling are about it at the end. Each paragraph has 2 to 3 quotations explored in detail, and we want to be making sure that for each of these we try to give reasons why we've chosen it. Because, as, and since, remember, are the important words there. The introduction is very brief, 4 lines long, and it emphasises the message of the poem, using a quotation from the end to help reinforce that. It also signposts or outlines what the 3 main topics for the main paragraphs are going to be. The body is a cage, the cage versus the nest, and then the resurrected body at the end. Each of these then forms the topic for the main paragraphs. The conclusion is about the same length as the introduction. It still focuses relentlessly on the question, and it summarises personal response to the message or meaning of the poem by picking out one particularly significant quotation and trying to give a few reasons why it's important. It also moves beyond just thinking the poem is merely about a bird by saying what the general message might be. So the body and soul needing each other and being able to be harmonised is something that gets you thinking about what difference having read this poem makes to your life generally.